Thank you, Dr. Lizabrand. And Aviva, congratulations on the success of Stand Up Nation. I think it's really, it's a book that will resonate, I believe, with anyone who is curious perhaps about not only about Israel's disproportionately positive contribution to developing nations in the world, but also, I think, the unexpected motivations behind it. My first question, I guess, is I'm curious to know, what was your first aha moment when you realized this is a book, I have to write it? When did that moment take place?
Thank you so much, Stefan, and thank you to JNF for having me on today. I'm a big fan of the organization and always a pleasure to be with you. So Stand Up Nation, which just came out, is really 10 years in the making. The origins go back to the time I used to be the speechwriter for Israel at the United Nations under Ambassador Ron Persor. There's one speechwriter and a lot to cover at the United Nations. The UN by itself covers a vast array of topics, from obviously peace and security and issues of global threats, but also things like international development and economics and legal issues, outer space, forestry, climate change, road safety. I mean, it's quite a remarkably long list. And I didn't have a lot of time to do research because of being only one speechwriter. But whenever it came to writing speeches about international development, I found that I would just fall down a rabbit hole reading about all the things that I found so interesting about Israel's earliest years as a pioneering state, stories about Golda Meir, who's behind Israel's International Development Agency, and this spirit of audacity that we've always seen in Israelis. And I found it to be a remarkable story and a largely untold story. Even people who are very familiar with Israel, have traveled there and studied it and read lots of books about it, have never heard of Mashav, Israel's Agency for International Development Cooperation, and don't know that Israel was a developing country itself for its first 10 years. It was desperately poor. Obviously, it's founded in the shadow of the Holocaust and the expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Jews from Arab nations. And this influx of new immigrants while having to fight wars of survival. This is not a land flowing with milk and honey as described by the Bible. It's a land that is dry and arid and swampy and malaria-ridden. And there isn't really anything there. And so the new immigrants who come with next to nothing need everything from the state. And the state, while it's trying to fight these wars, is also trying to provide housing and labor and educational services and so forth, every means of what these new immigrants need. And so they're living in what are ma'abarot, which are essentially tent cities, shanty towns made of tin or wood. There isn't clean running water. The Israeli government has to set up a ministry of rations. And this is the context in which Israel goes and founds an international development agency. It's quite frankly astounding that it was possible. And I tell the story in the book about how that happened and how Israel founds an international development agency before the United States, before Canada, before England, before the UN has UNDP. And then I fast forward to the present, and I profile about 20 Israelis who are the founders of truly remarkable international development and humanitarian relief organizations. And I ask the question, why is Israel so involved outside of its borders? It's certainly not winning any PR points for it or brownie points for it. And so what is the impetus? What's the driving nature behind what's going on here? And I do that through telling their stories.
Well, you clearly spent hundreds, if not thousands of hours researching, referencing, interviewing, and writing Stand Up Nation. I know in August 2023, you handed in the manuscript and you're probably already planning the book tour and all of that. And as we know, October 7th then happened a couple months after. How did you go about recasting Stand Up Nation to fit the current paradigm?
Yeah, so I submitted the manuscript for the book 6 weeks before October 7th, and then October 7th struck. And for many, many months, actually, we pivoted all the work of my nonprofit Boundless just to focus on the war. So the book got set aside. But when it finally came time to return to it, it was very clear to me that I needed to rewrite the introduction in light of the events of October 7th. And also I went back to those 20 Israelis that I interviewed, and I asked them if they wanted to write a postscript to their chapters, talking about the impact on themselves personally or on their organization in light of October 7th. And almost all of them did. And I think there's 2 points in particular. First of all, one of the people that I profiled in the book, her name is Dr. Shoshan Haram, from a kibbutz that most people would not have heard of before October 7th. She's from kibbutz Be'eri, and I remember actually interviewing her while she was in her house there. And Shoshan was one of the Israelis who was taken hostage on October 7th. Her husband was murdered. Her sister was murdered. She was taken with 6 members of her family, one of whom is still a hostage inside of Gaza. And so obviously the events of October 7th profoundly impacted every Israeli, every Jew, and certainly the events in this book, and the book had to be recast in that light. The second thing is that the book coming out at this time, I think, offers a reminder to us, which is that this is truly one of the most heartbreaking and devastating periods in all of Jewish history. We're on day 299. Tomorrow will be 300 days since the war started. There's more than 100 people still held hostages, including 5 American citizens who are still believed to be alive. And it's devastating. And we've also seen the rise of global anti-Semitism. And it's difficult to know how to comport ourselves. What are we supposed to do in this moment? And the story of looking back at Israel in its earliest days, where the challenges will feel eerily familiar. It's isolated. It's being ostracized on the international stage. It's facing economic hardships. It's facing legal challenges. It's facing social isolation. It's just an outcast in the world. And in addition to all the challenges of fighting enemies who seek its annihilation. And what we've always understood, it's really in Israel's Declaration of Independence, it says that Israel extends its hand to neighboring countries, to the nations of the world, and to the Jewish people, all to be a part of the project that is Israel. We've always invited other people to be a part of this project, and we've always understood at the end of the day that we are the authors, that there are these calamities that befall us, the Jewish people, and befall Israel, but that doesn't define us. October 7th doesn't define us. It's a chapter that's been written in our book, but ultimately we are the authors of where we go from here.
I think that's a really poignant point you make. And looking and reading through Stand Up Nation, you can see all these inspiring stories. And I think that really resonates with our Jewish National Fund USA base, because for us, we have many impactful projects. One that comes to mind is our CASA Joint Institute for Food, Water, and Energy Security, where we're creating these amazing partnerships with the University of Arizona, with Jewish National Fund USA, with Aviva farmers, and with Kenyan farmers. And what's incredible is there are these unexpected stories and collaborations that come out that if Israel, God forbid, wasn't there, these people would have nothing. And people don't always realize Israel's impact on the world. What are 1 or 2 stories from interviewing so many people in your book that really sort of stay in your mind, that you think about a lot? What sort of really drove home this miraculous story of Israel's contribution to the world?
There's different reasons that I give in the book. I sort of bucket the different people that I interviewed, and I explain that the reason that I believe that Israelis are so involved outside of their borders is for 4 reasons. And I call them idealism, pragmatism, adventurism, and chutzpahism. So idealism are the individuals driven by tikkun olam, who seek to make the world a better place. Shoshan Haram is a classic example of that. She had worked for a multinational seed corporation, and it was abundantly evident to her that the best seeds in the world, the ones that are best suited to grow in different climates and are going to yield the best type of produce, are going to the richest countries. They're the ones that are able to afford it. But the neediest farmers, mostly on the African continent, it's just so out of reach for them. And that was her life's work, was to figure out how is she going to get the best quality seeds into the hands of the most needy farmers in rural communities. And she was ultimately quite successful in doing so. You also have the stories of pragmatism, individuals that are seeking to uplift their communities, their societies, and their countries. So I tell the story of Save a Child's Heart. And there's a doctor, Dr. Ziwa, who became the first pediatric surgeon, a cardiac surgeon in Zambia. And he's trained by Israeli organization Save a Child's Heart. You have adventurism. These are, as we well know, many Israelis who, after they finish their time in the military, will go out backpacking, trekking in South America or in Africa or Southeast Asia. And some of them happened upon rural communities where they wanted to do something to help. And they founded organizations. And then you have a fourth bucket of the truly audacious individuals. I call them the chutzpahism category. And they're individuals who are doing this work, international development and humanitarian aid, in countries where Israel has no political or diplomatic relations, where if they were to be found out, they would be murdered. And one of the people that I talk about is Gal Lutsky from an organization called Israeli Flying Aid. And she has truly a remarkable history herself. She grew up in the kibbutz movement at a time where she was actually living in a children's home. She has always been a person who believes in giving. She tells a story about how she met a very poor woman when she was a teenager and on the spot decided to give her mother's washing machine, figuring her mother could just use the kibbutz laundry services. And she was very moved by what she saw on the television screen during the genocide in Rwanda, and ultimately took a few $100s, put it in her pocket, bought a one-way ticket, had never been on the African continent, had never worked in international development, and really got moved by the work. And she ultimately founds Israeli Flying Aid, and their motto is, no one asked permission to kill, so we're not going to ask permission to save lives.
Yeah, wow, that's powerful. Jumping around a little bit, I want to touch on your time working as a head speech writer for Israel's mission to the UN. So working in the UN, you've miraculously managed to live and tell the tale, despite everything we see there. Is it really the circus that we think it is, or is there some sinew of hope that you still have in the original mission of that organization?
When it comes to international affairs, when it comes to peace and security, when it comes to Israel, the UN is an abysmal failure. There's no nice way to sugarcoat it. It is, as we know, vehemently anti-Israel and biased. And you can see that not only in the major bodies and organs of the United Nations, but in the individuals who get appointed, in the reports that are written, and in the circus really that is the sessions that go on at the United Nations. One thing I will say about my time there was that it did prove to really be a training ground that was very formative, certainly for the work that I do now and the approach that I take as we look around at really a bewildering set of circumstances for Israel and the Jewish people. When I worked at the United Nations, people would often ask me, well, why does Israel participate? Why participate in an institution that is notorious for its bias against Israel? And more than that, to be a member in good standing at the United Nations, you have to pay dues. So Israel actually pays its dues in order to endure the sort of abuse and bias that we see on a daily basis. And as much as I would get asked that by friends, by family, by people in the community, we never once had that conversation inside of the delegation. And the reason is it never occurred to us for a moment that Israel has anything less than the absolute right to participate in and contribute to global affairs. And that's the mentality and the attitude that I've brought into the world with me ever since I worked at the UN, which is that Israel and the Jewish people have every right to participate in and contribute to equally their communities, their societies, their countries, and the global order. We're not going to accept anything less than that. And that means needing to call out the bias. So you have the United Nations, an institution that won't even call Hamas a terrorist organization. It can't bring itself to do that. That bias needs to be called out. In a time when young Jews have to hide their Jewish identity, and we live in an age of identity politics, when people are encouraged to identify as anything they want, but the one thing they can't safely identify as Jewish, well, that's nonsense. We're not going to accept that. We're certainly not going to accept a world that will speak with great sympathy about dead Jews, but not take any meaningful action to safeguard living Jews. So we need to call that out as well.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. And I'm one of your almost 300,000 followers on X or Twitter or whatever the name of it is today. And, I can't believe I thought you posted a satirical account where you shared the headline of the Wall Street Journal that reported on the death of the Hamas leader, Hania, where the headline, let me say it, the Wall Street Journal headline that you shared said, "Strike in Iran kills Hamas's leading advocate for a Gaza ceasefire." What is going on with these, mainstream headlines that we see? I mean, are we the only ones that see the world in a different light, or is some people in the media lost the plot? What's going on?
It's absolutely appalling, and it's not just the Wall Street Journal. If you scan the news headlines today, you'll see that there's many outlets that are calling Khania a moderate. They're calling him a peacemaker because he was allegedly in charge of the negotiations for the ongoing hostage deal and ceasefire talks. But it's absolute nonsense, because you would never see any of these papers calling a head of ISIS or the Taliban or Al-Qaeda a moderate. That they treat these organizations as if they're real countries is absurd. They lose sight of the fact that it's a terrorist organization, that there are countless clips. You don't even have to try hard when you Google to find the most abhorrent statements that Khania and other terrorist leaders have made about Israelis, about Jews, about wanting to slaughter them, and also about the ravaging damage that they've done to the Palestinian people. He was a billionaire living like a king in Qatar because he stole billions in international aid dollars from the Palestinian people and left them to suffer and to rot in Gaza. And this is a man that's now being lauded today by the international media. And that's another example of this overt bias that I see on a daily basis, and that I refuse to allow to pass without saying something, because we cannot accept that it is normal or acceptable.
Absolutely. I guess my final question to you, I and everyone at JNF, we're absolutely excited to see you speak this November 14 to 17 at Jewish National Fund USA's Global Conference for Israel in Dallas. And, I think a lot of people are attending because coming to the Global Conference for Israel is probably the closest thing you can get to actually being in Israel without traveling 7,000 to 10,000 miles to be there. For people coming, obviously they want to get a sense of what's happening on the ground. What's your biggest concern, or rather, what can the Jewish and pro-Israel community do here to really stand up for Israel and dispel the myths that they see? What should we all be doing right now in order to make sure that Israel, the truth about what's happening in Israel is getting out to our friends, family, neighbors, and the world?
Yeah, my short answer is I started with, I have enormous respect for JNF, and I think it's doing amazing work. So obviously supporting this organization and being a part of it and participating in the conference is one great way. And the longer answer I would say is that's actually a question I never get asked by Israelis. Israelis never say to me, what am I supposed to do? It's actually a question that only North Americans, especially American Jews, will ask me. And the answer is Israelis just do. They jump in and they see a need. And I would say that's the mentality that we have right now. The needs are astounding. The Jewish people are hurting. The people of Israel are hurting in a way that we've never seen before. And across the board, you don't have to look very far to see what the needs are. And they don't have to be big and splashy, like writing an op-ed or posting every 2 minutes on X like I do. It's finding a family that's been impacted by this war. It's helping to fight for the return of the hostages. It's supporting the communities that have lost their homes. It's helping with resilience programs and trauma therapy. Truly, the needs are endless, and it's figuring out what is your niche and your interest and then jumping in.
Well, Aviva, thank you so much for joining with Jewish National Fund USA and standing up for Israel. We really appreciate it. And thank you for your time today.
That's my pleasure. And please get Stand Up Nation.
Great.